Okay, great. So, thank you very much, everyone, for being here this evening. My name is Katrina Enroth. I am the Head of Global Engagement and Insights for Science Gallery International. And you are all very welcome for this second part in our ongoing art science conversation, Encompass. And Encompass has been put together by the Science Gallery Network for us to really discuss the meaning of collaboration between art and science and really work very closely with those people that are integral to everything that we do. So artists, designers, hackers, academics, researchers. For this evening's event, we are going to talk about residencies, their power and the impact they have not just on individuals, but on the institutions and broader communities that those individuals engage with. So before we get started, I want to remind you that you can use the Q&A function at any time to share your questions with the panelists. And also, do feel free to share your own experiences and observations about residencies in the chat. This session is supposed to be very participatory, and we want to hear from you as well. It really is meant to be a dialogue, so don't have any shyness about participating in that chat function as well. So without further ado, let me introduce your host for this evening, Antajuan Scott, who is a cultural producer and curator based in Detroit. Antoine is currently the head of programming for Science Gallery at Michigan State University, where he co-manages the open call process for programs and exhibitions, and he also works to create collaborations with artists, researchers, and institutions. Some of the projects that Antoine has undertaken recently include the Detroit Smellscape project with the MSU Broad Museum, chemist and installation artist Cecil Tolis as well, and then commissions with artist Laura D. Gibson and Indigenous collective The Adzukan, and co-curation of the Intersection, an art science program with MOCAD, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Detroit. And prior to his work with Science Gallery, Antoine served as Sciences Program Manager at Pioneer Works in Brooklyn. So, Antoine, I'm going to leave it to you to introduce the panelists. Take it away.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Katrina. So today we're joined by a wonderful group of individuals who are going to help us explore the importance of residencies. And so we're joined by Anna Dumitriu, is an award-winning, internationally renowned British artist who works in bioart, sculpture, installation, and digital media to explore our relationship to infectious disease, synthetic biology, and robotics. She has an extensive international exhibition profile, including ZKM, Ars Electronica, Beaux-Arts, the Picasso Museum, the V&A Museum, Philadelphia Museum, Philadelphia Science Center, MoCA Taipei, and LA Boral Art Laboratory Berlin, the History of Science Museum at Oxford as well. She was the 2018 president of the Science and the Arts section of the British Science Association. Her work is held in several major public collections, including the Science Museum of London and Eden Project. Anna is a renowned speaker and has presented talks on her prestigious works, including at venues such as Tate Modern, Princeton University, Imperial College of London, University of Oxford, and La Musée di Chasse et de la Nature in UCLA. Her work is featured in many books, including BioArt, Altered Realities, published by Thames and Hudson in 2016, and many other significant publications across contemporary art and science, including Frieze, Art Forum, International Magazine, Leonardo Journal, and the Art Newspaper, including Nature and The Lancet. She holds visiting research fellowships at the University of Hertfordshire, Brighton, and Sussex Medical School, and VAG, as well as artist in residence roles with Modernizing Medical Microbiology Project at University of Oxford, and with the National Collection of Type Cultures at Public Health England. We are also joined by Haseeb Ahmed, a research-based artist originally from the US, now living in Brussels. He produces objects site-specific installations, films, and writes for various publications. Often working collaboratively, Haseeb integrates methodologies from hard science into his art production. Currently, he works with the Von Karman Institute for Fluid Dynamics in Brussels for his project, the Winged Egg Trilogy. The project blends art and aeronautics, myth, and technology to create new narratives for the present. Ahmed has been a lecturer at the Zurich University of the Arts, Royal Academy of the Art in The Hague, St. Lucas Antwerp School of Art and Design. Ahmed received his PhD in practice-based arts at the University of Antwerp and St. Lucas Antwerp School of Art, and his master's from the MIT program in Art, Culture, and Technology. He has a Bachelor's of Fine Arts from the School of Art Institutes of Chicago. Ahmed has been a resident of the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht in the Netherlands, as well as Scott Hegan School of Sculpture and Painting in the US. His work has been exhibited internationally, including the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Gothenburg International Biennial of Contemporary Art, the Museum Berengaes in Zurich, as well as the Apple in Amsterdam. He is currently represented by Harlem Levy Projects in Brussels. We are also joined by Craig Martin, Associate Professor at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. Craig Martin is a teacher of history of science and technology. He is also the author of Renaissance Mediology, From Pomponazzi to Descartes, and Subverting Aristotle, Religion, History, and Philosophy in Early Modern Science. He's also translating Girolamo's Mercialis on Pestilence, available in 2022. He has received long-term fellowships from the Folger Shakespeare Library, the American Academy in Rome, the Huntington Library, Billy Tati at the Harvard Center for Renaissance Studies. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Claudia Schnugg, who is an independent researcher and curator developing methodologies for innovation and meaningful interaction with the arts, sciences, and technology. Her academic expertise builds on social and economic sciences, as well as the cultural sciences. As an advocate of art science collaboration, she has been a producer and curator of residency programs and catalyst for numerous international art science projects. Thereby, Claudia is working with leading scientific institutions, universities, tech corporations, and cultural partners, such as Helmholtz Center in Munich, Ars Electronica, Science Gallery, ESA, ESTEC, Accenture, and Pro Helvetia. Previously, she held the position of creative director at the Science Gallery Venice. She has worked with institutions like Science Gallery International to provide support in developing research, as well as art science projects for other organizations. In her academic career, Claudia has been an assistant professor at Johannes Kepler University in Linz, visiting professor of science at Copenhagen Business School, a professor at the European Southern Observatory, and the Art Science Center and Lab at UCLA. Claudia holds a PhD in social and economic sciences from the University of Linz. Her doctoral dissertation was designed as an interdisciplinary work at the Johannes Kepler University in Linz and the University of Art and Design in Linz. She analyzed formats and effects of artistic interventions in organizations from an organizational and art theoretical perspective. Her most recent book is Art Science Collaboration, available from Palgrave Macmillan. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and let's hop into our conversation. So our first question today is for Claudia, Haseeb, and Anna. I wanted to know if you had any examples of stories of change that relate to the places or institutions that you have been involved in residencies.
Do you want someone from us to start, or should I just jump in and start with some stories and some?
Yeah, please.
So you already mentioned a little bit in the beginning. So there are two parts. So there is the individual that is collaborating. Is it the manager, the scientist, the engineer, or whoever, and the artist, of course. And then of course there's the organization, and whatever impact you're searching or what kind of change you're searching for is very dependent on where in the organization you position these residencies and which direction you're coming from and what's the goal. So are you talking about a scientific organization, a university, or a cultural organization? Because even there, some change can happen when you start to work with a science collaboration, or is it a corporation? And as first Stearns is in the audience, and he already started to ask some questions. He also has worked with quite a few corporations. And when I started a few years back a conversation with him, he had these nice words about what changed in his organization back then at Planet Labs, about employee retentions. More employees or future employees started to apply to the organization because they felt that this is an organization where creativity and interdisciplinarity are really valued and where they can really contribute, because this corporation does something very specific, and this thing specific is having this residency program. And even those who were not really interested in directly collaborating with the artist felt that there is a change in culture, and a positive change in a more affirmative and supportive culture. And this is something that has been observed there by him, but it's something that I observed in quite a few organizations, that this openness, so that you suddenly come from a conversation about interdisciplinarity and doing something across boundaries to really having to realize it, which poses also quite a few challenges to organizations, because you need to break up routines and structures and how you think and work, even very specifically when you talk about what does it mean to use also these collaborations in science engagement. You have to go beyond the boundaries of these typical activities you do also in science collaboration, science communication, although the artists and the scientists are collaborating. And then another organization that I know where I see something really interesting happening from an organizational point of view is from Fraunhofer-Medis, where the head of science communication started to work or include a lot of artistic approaches, maybe collaborations, residencies, and other approaches, where suddenly the whole communications department started to be transformed from a pure one-directional communication into a more science engagement and lively dialogue between disciplines, between the organization and the public, but also between the generations, because they really want to reach out to young people and inspire them, and also inspire them to study and go into this direction. You really have to stop me if somebody else wants to talk about this, because there are plenty of changes. And even if you don't talk about, or even if you think you have a residency at a specific point in an organization, there might be other departments positively affected, because the residencies start to challenge the thinking and the way of working of others too. So for example, back then when Autodesk had the P9 residency, it was very much about creative exploration of the software and future thinking, and what users do with the software and what can be done, and all these different directions that can be explored. But looking closer, there are also a lot of challenges that came with these collaborations that spread beyond this pure explorative setting, and then started to influence, for example, the safety department to think about the future differently and how to interact with, in this case, with robots in future in industry settings even. So it goes from to, so you can have some changes in how you work interdisciplinary, how you think about exchanging ideas, and how you build new projects, about thinking anew through communication and outreach and engagement, but then spreading in the whole organization as challenging different departments, changing the culture, creating a new culture of working together, and also breaking up routines. And this breaking up the routines also comes in with something very individual and very personal, where, for example, when you talk about working interdisciplinary and bringing in new perspectives, it also is about talking about going beyond organizational blindness and uncovering blind spots. And these things you can already have also on a more organizational level when you start to break up these routines and question the routines that are so totally normal to everybody in the organization.
All right. Haseeb, could you add on to that? Thank you, Claudia.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think Claudia gave a beautiful overview of the different possibilities for change. I think that, just to add, I think that what's often asked is the question, like, what is the impact? That's kind of like the keyword or the jargon that's used. What has been the artistic impact? Or and that's often what you have to reply to when you have the reports that come afterwards, because usually these things are funded through granting agencies that require you to write a report that assesses what actually came out of these things, in fact. And I think that it's in those moments that you can actually think about, well, what is the criteria of impact itself? How do you assess different kinds of qualities? And I think there's a unique quality that artworks in themselves are indeterminate. It's unique in the form of other types of production that you never really know. An artwork can mean many different things to many different people, and that kind of bleeds over into artistic residencies when they're embedded within institutions as well. So it's just kind of what it requires, as Claudia is also suggesting, was it requires a kind of reflective moment, which often doesn't happen because there's a kind of metabolism that's always looking forward. And I think, for me, I tried to incorporate that then into the work that I'm doing, So for instance, at the Van Karmen Institute, I created a vulture aviary within the institute itself, which is a NATO institute that's training aeronautical engineers that will most likely go into military industrial complex jobs. So what does it mean when you have a vulture aviary, an animal that's typically associated with death, within one of these, within this institution itself? And what is that opportunity then to ask certain questions about the larger context? Because I think, just to speak broadly again, is, it's about the severe atomization that occurs through specialization, where everybody's sort of being driven into specific specialties, and how do you create moments of unlikely encounters? And it's especially because within the other disciplines, people, especially within the sciences, people are being driven into the delivery of expertise rather than fundamental research. So I think that artistic interaction allows for a possibility of renewing an interest in fundamental research, away from, let's say, like the demands of industry on scientific research itself. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Anna, we would be remiss not to include you in on answering with your experience in residencies.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, Claudia has interviewed a lot of the scientists that several of the scientists I've worked with, so maybe she knows more about this kind of stuff than I do in terms of the institution side, because I tend to deal with people and it's about the interaction with the one-to-one thing. But the way I work with whole research groups, so I will be having interactions with lots of different people, and we make art together. They kind of show me how to do stuff in the lab hands-on, and I really enjoy what I call the boring moments. One of my collaborators and I gave a talk on the boring moments once. That bit in the lab when you're waiting for a PCR machine to do its stuff, 15 minutes for something to spin around or something like that. And that's when you have these really esoteric, interesting conversations and really get into the sort of the ideas behind it. Why is it like this? Why do you think this? And sort of the ethics. So I think bringing that kind of conversation into the organizations is really nice. And I know that a lot of the scientists that I work with carry on, and that, I mean, they keep carrying on working with me. So I have these very long-term collaborations. One, I suppose my longest one's about 20 years now. So and then they seem to continue even into different organizations. So there's that side. And then on the other hand, there's the sort of thing where you actually impact the work that they're doing. So with Schindler, we did the STARTS residency, Alex May and I, with Schindler, working with their new technologies team, and we were building a robot and sort of looking at a lot of research about different biases that occur in robotics making. And in the end, we started doing talks with their diversity officer that they have, and actually doing lectures where he was using the robot as a means to communicate some of the issues they were working with. And there were also changes to some of the ways they were styling the robots and naming the robots. So that was sort of a kind of change, I think, as well.
Yeah, you all have mentioned very creative ways of artists impacting institutions via research and collaboration. But as we are emerging from this COVID-19 experience, I was interested in learning if there's anything that you would recommend from your recent experiences that you would implement as a part of a residency program moving forward. So let's start with you, Anna.
Well, I've been doing this residency, which started just in the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. We were kind of putting it together just as that happened. And we decided to kind of, rather than put it on hold, kind of go ahead through a kind of virtual residency of lots and lots of online meetings, because it's a new area. It's with the Helmholtz Institute, the Institute of Epigenetics and Stem Cells. And that's quite a steep learning curve for me, because I hadn't worked specifically in that area before. I worked a lot with genomics, and I'd done some stuff about, gene regulation and things like that. But this is another step forward. So I've had a lot of online meetings with individual scientists where they've explained their research, and we've had lovely kind of fantastic chats and come up with experiments that we'll do when I reach the lab. Now, I wouldn't want to do it maybe as intensively that I've done it with this, because it's in the certain circumstances of the COVID pandemic. But I think having these online chats before you get to the lab are actually quite good, because they save time. They say, and you can do stuff like, I spent 2 days at the Liu Lab for Synthetic Evolution in the University of California, just doing health and safety training. I mean, you could do things like that before you go, and it would be a kind of really practical way of using these platforms that we've now got access to kind of speed up the process when you actually get there, so you can kind of get stuck straight in, hands-on in the labs, in the Petri dishes or whatever.
Absolutely, thank you. So Craig, you have experience in a residency that was definitely impacted by the COVID-19 situation. I'm really interested in hearing from you and about your experience within the Earth, Water, Sky residency at Venice.
Yeah, so we adopted a program similar to what Anna just described, although since there was fewer people, it was more or less just Haseeb and I meeting online, talking about our common interests, and trying to understand how those might feed into each other. I suppose one of the sort of surprising effects of the pandemic was also changed at least the way I was thinking about my work. So the Haseeb's project is about wind, and the idea sort of generally is also to understand wind in a specific context of Venice and Venice's history. And wind was considered in the 16th and the 17th centuries, and before that, a major cause of plague and pandemic disease more generally, specific kinds of winds. So the project, at least, I mean, some of the ideas we were thinking about, we sort of actually fit into the ideas related to the pandemic. Now we're still waiting to actually meet each other in person. So I hope it will be a kind of a similar experience to what Anna just described, where we'll have taken care of lots of preliminary conversations, and when we finally have the in-person residency, we can move forward. Now, I suppose to answer your initial question that you asked Anna, I think maybe the major lesson is that patience is required for these residencies, and this might also relate to some of the things that were said earlier about the indeterminate nature of the products and how to judge the impact of the projects. And I mean, I think the pandemic has probably tested the patience of nearly everyone in the world, and it's also sort of maybe slowed down some of the processes, and maybe in the end that won't necessarily be a bad thing. But I think I hope all of the organizations and institutions can recognize that quality is needed.
Yeah, Haseeb, can we hear from you on the question of what have you learned from this COVID-19 impacted residency experience?
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, yeah, Craig and I have been speaking now for almost over a year as we've been doing the residency at Science Gallery in Venice and together with Kafka University. And indeed, while we were supposed to meet in person, I think that we've had really productive conversations in the meanwhile. And I think that in the one hand, it kind of emphasizes this kind of flexibility, which is necessary conception of time, which should change from like a kind of immediacy to kind of more also flexible conception, let's say. But I created a website for instead, like what we ended up doing was like shifting to a digital format for the residency, for which we designed a specific kind of website, which then I was thinking about, okay, like what do you do with artistic research? How do you present this research not in a state of research and not necessarily in a as something which is meant for as a completed work, not at the same status as an artwork itself. So yeah, you can see it, it's in the chat now. And through this, I was able to synthesize a lot of the conversations that Craig and I were having. And I think that what became interesting is that for me, and I think also the interest that Craig and I have, like I kind of realized I needed to be like really much more adamant that for me, the interest in wind and air is not really a theme. My work is not necessarily about wind or air, but it's really a fluid medium which has its own properties that I want to work with and I want to work through. And that also has a history of working with and through the air. And to kind of merely turn it into a thematic would be a kind of quite a reduction. And this is what I had to kind of think through when I was also presenting the research and thinking through also when I have now a sustained history of engagement with this over the last like 10 years or so now working with the wind. It kind of emphasized that even more when it was only being conveyed in a digital format rather than something which is experiential as an exhibition. And yeah, this historical perspective about the realities of what the wind conveys, like for example, the pestilence, the plague itself from the 15th century really helped to kind of, yeah, substantiate this thinking as well.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So let's focus back on institutions for a moment. And as we know, these types of collaborations between institution and artists can oftentimes present issues for the institution in regards to really understanding what the outcome will be. And so, Claudia, I was really interested in hearing from you in explaining what types of value and benefit institutions have for thinking about and creating residency programs and collaborations.
So I think there are numerous opportunities. So first of all, you can think of it as either and we had this also previously, as Haseeb talked about the outcome and the artwork as the outcome, but that's actually not the only outcome, and that you can value the impact differently. So you have a lot that happens in the process. So you have a, just as in research, you have a research process, and then you publish the papers, or you publish the book, or you have your research outcome. You have the artistic research process, and then you go into several directions and see how it evolves. And the same thing happens also with the art science collaboration process and with the residency. And the residencies can be very different. So you can have this one-to-one collaboration, you can have an artist in a lab, you can have an artist more broadly moving in the organization. And what you have to be aware of, this process is not only an individual process, it's not only the artistic process and the science process. Through the collaboration, a lot happens between so not only pushing borders of disciplinary thinking, but also between people. So, and actually, when you think from a more learning perspective, or from an organizational perspective, there is a lot in social science, in psychology, social psychology, and educational research, where you really think about the people and what happens along the way. And this is something that's also not really alien to management or other positions in an organization, to understand that this process is also something that can impact the outcome, so the research and new research directions, the artwork. And then you can measure how it's contextualized in the research setting, or in the theme, or in the artistic contemporary setting. But then you can also think about how is this interrelated with strategic development of the organization, or of a lab, of a department. Going back to what Anna said, that I interviewed a few of her scientific partners. There are often new connections that can evolve through these collaborations with artists, because in the case of Anna has in a certain field of scientific field, quite a few interesting collaborations that are not specifically from the same deep field, but somehow connected. So she can relate to them and establish these connections, and they can be really interesting for some of the labs also to follow afterwards. But then sometimes something completely unforeseen happens, as in another organization, and actually collaboration that I'm working with right now. It's an artist, Anthony Eichekov, with a startup, Tech AI. Originally, the idea was having the artists and the scientists, more from the technological part, collaborate to create something really interesting about what the startup is doing. But in the end, we have the artwork, and then there is something coming along the way in the middle, on this middle ground, which is also some interesting exploration of techniques for the artists, but also a really interesting new development for the startup they would not have done before otherwise. So they haven't even thought of creating new visualizations or something new to deal with on another more aesthetic level in their organization. And these things often just come through the process. And this is something that has to be clear. The outcome is not always just the one outcome that we determine. And what we determine is, of course, what we want to have from these residencies. So sometimes even, some interesting rapid residencies, as Science Gallery is doing it now in Dublin, and you're doing it in Detroit, can be really impactful in this very specific thing that they want to do. And it's really about how do we talk about the outcome, how do we talk about the process, and how do we talk about this goal related to what is the organization's goal? Is it a scientific organization? Is it a corporation? Is it a cultural organization? And how is it also then giving space to the artists and to the scientists to work together? And then you can start to evaluate from there. But I think it's always difficult to just come from this idea that you want to innovate, or do you want to have a very specific outcome in science or in art.
Yeah, thank you for that very thorough explanation. I really think that the processes of residencies have and can evolve, but there are like specific issues that may arise for individuals who are interested in certain opportunities, but not necessarily able to pursue them. So in thinking about barriers of entry, given your experiences with an extensive amount of residencies, Anna, can you take a stab at this question first? Are there any barriers of entry that should be reconsidered for these types of large scale residencies and collaborations?
Yes. So there's one point that it's quite often a big problem, especially with the larger scale residences and also with smaller scale residences, is that I say at least 90% of them expect you to buy flight tickets, hotel stuff, and everything all in advance and then claim it back. And sometimes I've reached stages with projects where I'm owed kind of £6,000 in expenses and it's all on my credit card, and I've got a good credit limit and I pay it off when they give me the money, but like this is not viable, especially if you don't have, haven't like done this over many years and kind of built up a credit limit. It's like you can't do that. And also they end up charging you interest. It can take 4 months for the money to come. And that's a cost that I think is a very tangible thing. That is something that residencies can think about, is not having the artists have to upfront all the expenses. So, I mean, some of them are getting better with this now, but I've still had it in recent years.
Haseeb, how about you? Do you think there's any like barriers of entry that you would like reconsidered for residency programs, given your experience?
I think that, yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, to speak to Claudia's point, I think what's really good is that a lot of residencies are relinquishing the requirement that of what should be produced, that there should be an outcome of an exhibition or an artwork, and just trusting that artists are kind of implicitly productive in a way, that they will do things and they just don't know. And in this way, by getting rid of the expectation, it opens up what that might be or how that might be, which I think is a much more inevitably a productive standpoint. Yeah, I think that there is, yeah, like it really depends. I mean, I think that some of the places that might need the residencies the most, let's say, are the ones that are most unlikely to have them, in the sense that I think what artistic residency allows for is also showing what is not happening within an institution or company, like what is not being fulfilled, and what by creating those interests, like it produces a certain kind of standpoint. So for instance, like working with aeronautical engineer, like I've been working with Olivier Chazot for some years. He's a head of the aerospace department at Van Carmen, but he's also a phenomenologist, a philosopher, and something he was never able to address within his working environment, but able to address once an artist arrives within his working environment. So this is one possibility. And I guess like, I mean, the practicalities of what Anna is describing are also real oftentimes. So it's, there is, yeah, I mean, I think that it's true within even academia that, like, for instance, you have to have a grant in order to write a grant, to have enough time to actually write one of the massive grants, you already have to have a grant. And within the artistic residency processes, I mean, like they're demanding to formulate a proposal, to formulate something completely based off of. So I think like maybe adapting something which is similar to a public art project funding system, in which you just submit initial call for an appeal, and then they also like then fund maybe part where you develop the actual substantial part of your proposal, would give more, would make it possible to solicit submissions of higher quality, I think, and also make it more amenable for the artists themselves. So.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Craig, do you have anything to add to that question?
I mean, I don't really know if I do. I mean, I can see that there are lots of barriers to entry to all sorts of kinds of people. And I think perhaps the pandemic has shown how difficult travel can be. But of course, that's been the case for depending on nationalities. International travel has been difficult for people from many different countries. I suppose there's also lots of barriers of entry that are based on familial reasons, that it's difficult for certain people to actually participate in a residency, or also for reasons of health. I mean, a place like Venice, if you're actually here in person, it involves lots of walking. There are many bridges, and that can be a barrier for some individuals as well. I don't know if I really have a solution to that, but I suppose the institutions that have these residencies should, I hope, keep those in mind to make sure that as many different kinds of people are able to participate in them.
Haseeb, you have an add-on?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to add one thing. One thing that I think would be beneficial is also that I think that there's sometimes like it might be helpful to kind of cultivate the experience about also like what art is. Because I think that if this is a first exposure, especially with art and engineering or sciences or even any other field within academia, there can often be a kind of misunderstanding, especially if the ambition is to create innovation within the hosting institutions. So oftentimes what's considered art is in fact actually design, and meaning that it has a direct application and it's not actually a primarily reflective process or critical process, which is what art often is, So this kind of design, and you see that actually throughout many of the things that, like, for instance, in the STARTS prizes, what's being funded is usually design projects and design practices, but there is no distinction being made between what is a speculative design practice and what is an artistic practice. And in a way, it's not necessarily to get hung up on the nomenclature, but I think this can also be productive to think through, in fact, like, well, what is art specifically? What is the history of art? And the history of art is not is also has something to offer within this context. And I do think that there's a kind of ahistorical approach sometimes. So how do we tag on to certain kind of histories? I think that there are common stopping points. For example, like Bell Labs is often mentioned, Black Mountain School, Bauhaus. But I think even beyond these first stopping points, there are other really important historical practices that have been cultivated and might have been forgotten that can legacies that can be continued as a. So we're not always starting from zero also, and that we are starting within the domain of art and not necessarily design or not necessarily innovation or startup culture and so on. This is a kind of a broad statement I'm making, but I think that this would be productive.
Yeah, thank you for adding that in. We have a really interesting question from the Q&A, and it's in regards to how intellectual property and copyright is managed when working with such large corporations and creating collectively. And so, Claudia, I would like for you to give a stab at how does one keep or manage their creative property, their creative rights, when in collaboration with such large companies and organizations with so many resources?
So I was just checking again because I was still with the other question where I wanted to add something before. This one is more about the copyright and IP rights question.
Right.
So I think here, and this is something that I often repeat. This is not fully thought through by no one yet. There are too many ways to go, and too many also legal restrictions depending on country, and incongruences also between the rights in arts and proprietary rights in business and corporate law. So there's already a little bit of a question mark what actually applies and how to talk and how to work this through. So there are quite a few really interesting approaches where also big corporations really say, so the artist's work is the artist's work. And what comes out in the inspiration for the scientist or for the engineers is on the side of the corporation. Others are also even thinking about really fair pay for the artist. So when they want to have the artist on a longer term in the organization and something comes out of that, they pay them as much as they pay their scientists per month. So this is also an idea of how you could compensate for these innovative ideas that come out of that and that are then used by the corporation, because the corporation deals also with what their employees develop in this way. So this is also another approach. But I think what's standard right now with corporations is really that the artwork is the artist's IP, and the rest is part of the corporation or the industrial partner, unless there is a joint patent or something that's coming out of the collaboration. And often these residencies are not in depth enough that something like that is really the end outcome. But some, of course, have longer residency processes, up to a year or longer, or collaboration processes, maybe not the full year is a residency. And then, of course, things are differently. But yeah, the big question is also which law is applying, and all these different things that I don't know that any lawyer or anyone with this specific background has a final solution or has approached this problem yet. But I also know that it's not only the artist studies somehow is giving away things like ideas and the creative process and collaborating with the corporation. It can also happen the other way around. So there could be also a problem that things leak that shouldn't leak and are used in artistic work or in presentation that shouldn't be used. And then again, how you cope with that. There are many difficult questions. So it's actually a little bit easier in the university setting than in the corporate setting.
Yeah, so you mentioned some really clear outlines and ways to ensure that value is kept in its owner's hands. So being very clear about what is owned by who, and also actual compensation for research and time spent, yes, are ways that larger organizations can definitely contribute to intellectual property exchanges. I saw Anna shaking her head along as you were talking, and I know that you have something to add to this question on intellectual property.
I was actually nodding because I think Claudia was pretty spot on with how it works. I mean, it was interesting because we did the Starts residency with Schindler, so we had all the huge legal department of the company kind of interrogating this, who owns what and who brings in what. And then the Starts contract was ratified under Portuguese law. So we had the Swiss, Portuguese, English kind of melange of a kind of contract, which was quite strange. The important thing is for me, is that I own the artwork. So I think I was shaking my head at the bit about it's easier in universities, because that's not always my experience. It depends. I mean, when I collaborate with scientists in universities, that's one thing. When I get commissioned by universities to do art research projects, I've had the case where they wrote into the contract that they owned the IP on the artwork, and I had to quite kind of fight with them to, in the end, get the IP signed back over to me, because I was like, well, do you want the artwork? Are you going to put it somewhere? What are you going to do with it? And they didn't want it. So like they didn't have anywhere to store it or anything, and I wanted it to exhibit. And they didn't have like the means to curate or show it or anything. So I was like, so sign it back to me. And so that's what happened in this case. But it was complicated, and it was kind of quite irritating at times to kind of go through that. So it was easier with the Starts project, where it was nice and clear with the lawyers, and we kind of all fought it out before everything happened. But that always delays the residency by months, I have to say. It always
takes months.
That stuff.
But just one thing to add to that. What I also experienced, and this experienced more with universities, is that they sometimes don't really have the feeling of what they say when they say they want to own the IP. Sometimes they just want to have the rights to show it everywhere. And they don't want to have the full IP of the artwork, and they don't want to have to own the artwork just themselves. So it's really it's also a learning process for everybody who is part of these projects, because there are lots of people who have no idea, as soon as you transgress the borders of your own discipline, what it actually means when you say something like that to an artist or in this context. So there's a lot of awareness building and building up knowledge about what it has to, or what this context actually understands of these different aspects of working together and collaborating.
Haseeb, you have something to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to add also that I mean, I haven't had that much of an experience in a negative sense. Usually it's the agreement that the artist will retain the artwork afterwards, in my experience so far. But what I think is interesting is that the residencies, especially in this context, are like way ahead of the curve, because if you work, for example, with galleries and with museums, like if I had an exhibition with a museum, and even up until the last moment, it's still a gentleman's agreement. It's a handshake. Even with the gallery that I work with, it's just an agreement that you have. It's a verbal agreement, and so there is no the artist contracts themselves are like almost they're not really the norm within the rest of the art world. Let's say it's really about trust, and it's a lot of things based off of trust. Many things within the art world themselves are unregulated typically, and I mean that's what makes it this kind of like Wild West economically. You know, anything from money laundering to innovation to to experimental forms of cooperation, but it's I think that in a way, I'm just saying, I just wanted to kind of throw that into relief, that is, from my experience with the rest of the art world outside of art science collaborations, there is this kind of deeply unregulated character, and it's all about trust and gentlemen's agreements, as they call them, handshakes and so on. Yeah.
Anna?
I just wanted to add that the contracts, although they're, you know, you've got a contract and stuff like that, if you did want to fight it, you'd need a lot of money. And artists don't tend to have that money. So in a way, it's still a gentleman's or a gentle person's agreement, because you don't have much hope of actually fighting I couldn't mount a legal challenge to something in some other country's legal system and stuff. It's way beyond my time or anything like that. So it's and financial means way beyond that. So it's still kind of just hope and fingers crossed all the time.
So we are in the last 5 minutes of our program, and we'll try to get to as many questions in the Q&A as possible. There was a question in the Q&A that did relate to contracts. And the question is, how much can be written into the initial contract, and how much of it can be developed in an ad hoc capacity based on the individual's creative skill set that is coming into that residency? So we talked about, like, you know, establishing boundaries, but how much of that can be presented in advance from either the organization or artist perspective? And is that something that is favorable in building trusting relationships? So Anna, could you give that a stab?
I mean, I always say that I'm a great believer in being as vague as possible, especially in terms of contracts or in terms of anything I say I'm going to do, because that creates, and it's very important to, as vague as possible. So not more vague than is possible. That's very specific. So just to give yourself enough freedom in what you're going to do. So in terms of the time scale, in terms of, the how the budget is divided up in terms of what you're going to make, and who you're going to work with, how. It's best to be as vague as possible and then let the thing evolve. So I'm a great believer in that, which I refer to in my earlier comment about I couldn't fight the contract anyway, probably. So does that help?
Claudia, you had something to add on?
No, it's just also from the other side's perspective. I think unless you have something that you want to have realized as an artwork, also jurors tend to go into a direction where you have something that has potential but is not yet fully developed, because then you still have space to do something new or turn into a completely different direction, but explore the basic concept or something else substantially. And this is something that's very valuable in residencies. So I think, so it's really this being as vague as possible, but showing that you have researched and that you have an idea what you want to do and how it's valuable.
So as we all know that the contract is related to the outcomes and expectations that the organization has for its artists. And so when thinking about the creation of a residency program, we know the outcomes can be research-based or in the form of a physical object. Craig, do you think that it's important to understand exactly what the outcome will be prior to beginning the residency? Or is it okay to figure that out along the way?
Well, I'm glad we're moving away from contracts, my view is that I mean, these residencies are a time to explore and to come up with new ideas. And so, if we already know what the product would be, then we're not really using the residency in the correct manner. I mean, maybe this goes back to an earlier point that you have to have a grant to write a grant proposal, practically. But I mean, I think the best residencies aren't ones where we're just finishing up something that we've already started, but we're actually exploring new ideas. So I think that really means that we shouldn't necessarily expect an end product, or that the end product doesn't have to correspond to what was initially proposed.
Haseeb, can you add on to that?
Yeah, I think it's nice I like Craig's emphasis, that in the end it's about producing artworks and seeing where things will go and seeing how far the rabbit hole leads, or where it leads, and that kind of mutual trust that something will happen and not knowing what it is, and that excitement of the surprise, serendipity, I think is, like, for me, one of the most rewarding experiences in art making and in residencies as well. So
we have time for one final question, and I'm going to go into the Q&A because I think this is really interesting. So for Sternax, does a successful residency need to have a manager on the ground who is working shoulder to shoulder between the artist and the institution or individuals for it all to work? Claudia.
I'm totally pro having somebody on the ground. Maybe you call this person manager or curator or somebody. Because you build the bridges also between the organization and the artists. So the artist, it's very difficult if you come to an organization, you don't know where to go first, and you don't know how the structure works, and you don't know with whom to speak in order to get what you want. So this is something that you definitely need. And then, I think it's also, and also coming a little bit back to this these hybrid residencies, even there, often this person in between is extremely important. So it also depends on, of course, on the artists and the collaborating partners, but sometimes both might be, it might be the first time to collaborate in this way and to talk to each other. So building up trust helps if there is a trusted person who understands both languages. So this is something that's also that should not be undervalued, because you need the trust into that this is something interesting, not only the excitement of the possibility that's somewhere in the future, but also understanding the language that might be completely new to you. Or we all know that we often talk to each other and don't understand each other. So this for this person also helps a lot, or also to support, just to create some more support in and guiding the process, and also seeing a situation where maybe the artist would step back a little bit, or the scientist would step back a little bit in what the ambitious goal would be that they want to reach in order to have a more smooth outcome or so, and then having somebody to push the collaboration is really important too.
Does anyone else want to give that question a go? Anna?
I'd say both ways are nice, because I'm working with Claudia, obviously, and that's lovely. But also, I have to a soft no. It doesn't need to have a manager, because there are. It depends on the situation, because there are lots of residencies I do where I work directly with the scientists. So I just go in and I kind of organise it myself. In fact, the first big residency I did, which was in the Centre for Computational Neuroscience and Robotics at Sussex University, they actually called me the self-organizing artist, and that was the title of the residency, was playing with this idea of self-organizing systems. But the idea was just get stuck in, Anna, and go and knock on doors and sort of make it happen. So it depends on personalities as well and things like that. But I'd say both ways can work.
It can work, but sometimes either the artists can have a problem in finding their way, or they are not that outgoing.
Yeah.
And sometimes
it's a yes or no thing, and I was saying
and sometimes it's also the organizational culture and structure, because sometimes this can be also depending on big organizations or very bureaucratically grown organizations. This can be really tough, because then you can't go and knock on all these doors, because people need to write their hours hourly, and it's really difficult to get into these conversations without having somebody in between and also building up the relationships. So it really, it's true. So there can be really interesting collaborations without the manager on the ground. But I'm very much, not only because it's often my role, but what I also see in how organizations and managers and other people in the organization then understand the value of this residency can also be supported by this person then observing what happens, talking about key moments, talking about what they saw, because you often don't realize yourself what happened in these conversations and where you actually suddenly drifted into a different direction and got your new idea from. So I think all these stories are also important to be told in organizations, so that they are welcoming to future residencies, and that it's not just some kind of nice thing that one scientific group or one scientist wants to do on their own budget.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for your participation in today's panel. Craig, Anna, Claudia, and Haseeb. Your insight was very much so appreciated, as well as you giving personal anecdotes from your own experiences. The Encompass Art Conversation series, its second, is now complete. Thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate it. And please be sure to check back with Science Gallery for the third session for Encompass, which will be on cultural production and presented as a part of the Virtual Arts Electronica 2021 Festival. So Thank you all, and good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.